We were to have Alexander Downer speaking to us next, but unfortunately he had to return early to the United Kingdom, to his home. I just leave that hanging in the air. But the good fortune that we did have was he spent last Tuesday afternoon at the Howard Library with us, and we do have an interview with him where he says all of the things that he said he would have said to you in person had he been here. So please enjoy this conversation with Alexander Downer and the Howard government and its foreign policy. Thanks, everyone. Alexander Downer, welcome to the Howard Library in the 4th Howard Government Retrospective Conference. Thanks for joining us.
It's a great pleasure.
Was there, do you think, a coalition tradition or approach to foreign affairs of which you were conscious and wanted to pursue when you became the Minister in March of 1996?
Well, I became the Minister, by the way, on the back of having been for a while a career diplomat. And for the previous year, I had been the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. So through my life, I had had plenty of time to think about this issue. And I think it can best be summarised this way. We were focused as a government very much on the national interest. And we saw foreign policy, including trade policy, as a tool of promoting the national interest. And I would contrast that with the Labor approach, which was a much more ideological approach. Gareth Evans' approach, the Labor approach even to this very day, is, if you like, more multilateralist. They use expressions like good citizenship being an objective of foreign policy. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to be a bad citizen, but I do want to promote the national interest. And if in promoting the national interest we rub up against people on occasions, well, that's just too bad. We must pursue our national interest. So this whole concept of foreign policy being about the promotion of our national interest, which we defined as our security interests, our economic interests, and the protection and promotion of our values, was at the heart of our foreign policy from when we were in opposition, when I was the leader of the opposition, and when we came into government. So we knew when we came into government what our core functions were going to be in the foreign policy sphere. We knew exactly what, in the broad direction we wanted to go in. We didn't know what events we would confront, but we knew what direction we wanted to go in.
So you followed two long-serving foreign ministers in Bill Hayden and Gareth Evans. Labor had held the reins of power for 13 years. Was there much in the department that you felt the need to change when you became the minister?
Well, I mean, inevitably the department, after 13 years of a particular foreign policy paradigm, the department took some persuading to change. But I mean, it gradually did change, because it's an incredibly professional department. I mean, I think PM&C, Treasury and DFAT are by a very big margin the most professional government departments in Australia, state and federal. So there are a lot of very clever, very able people in DFAT who serve as distinguished public servants, and they simply carry out the policy of the government. They provide some advice, of course. So the Labor Party in government had talked very much about engagement with Asia, and Australia's destiny was in the Asia-Pacific region. And I used to wonder why they talked about that so much, because that just seemed like obvious. You only had to look at where Australia was on a map of the world to know that as a significant but not a great power, Australia first of all had to secure its economic and security destiny in its own broadly defined neighbourhood. I think DFAT and the Labor government were fawning in their approach to Asia, begging to be accepted as part of a region. Whereas my view was, we are part of a region, and this is true of all human relationships. People aren't going to take much notice of you if you don't have much to offer them. So going along to the Indonesians or the Thais or whoever it was, the Chinese, and begging them to take us seriously, and turning up there and describing our geography to them, it seemed to me weak. Better to demonstrate our worth to our neighbours through things like the strength of our economy, if not size, the proficiency of our defence forces, and the soft power that Australia is able to deploy, which is actually quite substantial. And as the region, once we became the government and as the years wore on, and as the region, the Asia-Pacific, now called the Indo-Pacific region, came to understand what Australia brought to the table, so they grew to respect us more, and as they respected us more, they included us more. So I think that was not only my approach right from the beginning, but it was an approach that worked incredibly well in our, remember the phrase, national interest.
And did you have a 100-day plan for your first 3 months in office, a national plan? And did the fact that the first Howard government last just over 2 years curtail what you were thinking about doing and did do in that first term?
Not like a media story would have it, a 100-day national plan, so you can go to the National Press Club and explain what you've done in the first 100 days. And, these are media games. Foreign policy is more serious than that. So we began a process of slowly building to do the things that we wanted to do. So remember, and I certainly had in my mind how Australian foreign policy should work. We had a foreign policy that we released before the 1996 election. So we had a foreign policy that we wanted to implement, and we would use events to build that foreign policy. So 1998, we may have had an election. I mean, an election is something you have to focus on the election, of course, for the 5 weeks of the election campaign. But foreign policy isn't going to change much in those 5 weeks. It's a caretaker period, so nothing much happens. So I don't think the election was all that. I mean, it was a tough election and all of that, but I don't think it disrupted our foreign policy very much, no. So I started out, I suppose, from the very beginning thinking, this is our approach, which I've described to you. What are the problems? What are the immediate problems that we need to deal with, bearing in mind our approach? So there were two. There were two quite immediate ones. One of them was the Bougainville Civil War. I've often said this, something like 4 times as many people were killed in the Bougainville Civil War as died in the Northern Ireland Troubles. Up until the Good Friday Agreement. So this was a very bloody and difficult civil war, draining the resources of Papua New Guinea, humiliating the Papua New Guinea Defence Force. And we are on the border of Bougainville, and an Australian mining company was behind the Bougainville mine and the whole issue. And I know Gareth Evans and the department had tried as best they could to deal with this issue, but they hadn't succeeded for whatever reason. And I thought, well, we have to try to fix it. I mean, I think a lot of people in DFAT took the view, well, that's a bit difficult to do. And, we're going to end up with, unintended consequences and so on. But by the way, we did fix it, working with the New Zealanders, because I understood quite quickly we needed to work with New Zealand to fix that, because it was an Australian mine. So some of the Bougainville Revolutionary Army people thought they were not only fighting Papua New Guinea, they were fighting Australia. Australia was the enemy. So I had to placate them, but the New Zealanders were able to play a really important role in that. So working with New Zealand, we fixed the Bougainville Civil War. And what was the other big issue? The other big issue was East Timor. East Timor in and of itself wasn't such a big issue, but Indonesia was. And so the foreign policy establishment, the Gareth Evans, the Dick Walcotts, Rawdon, Dalrymples, all of these people who you might say constituted the Labour foreign policy elites through those years, Michael Costello. Their view was the kind of Keating view, that Indonesia is the main game and don't worry about East Timor. And the department tried to persuade me of that. And I said to them, I remember they never really agreed with me on this. I said to them, well, the trouble is that I understand how important Indonesia is. I understand that. But our relationship with Indonesia is always going to be hostage to problems in East Timor. So how do we fix the East Timor problem? Oh, well, you know, that can't be done. It must remain part of Indonesia. That was their view. So we just support the Indonesians in maintaining it as part of Indonesia and give them lectures on human rights every so often. So when the Indonesians, you know, during that period in our first term in government, actually, the Indonesians would talk to me about this, which was in the form of Ali Alatas, typically, or President Suharto. They said they wanted to give Indonesia wide-ranging, give East Timor wide-ranging autonomy. Well, I didn't reckon that would work. So I told them I would go and ask the East Timorese whether they thought that was acceptable or not. And they said they didn't think it was, unless they had an act of self-determination. So, I mean, we had an election in 1998, but after the election, straight after the election, the Howard letter, we sent the so-called Howard letter, which was originally drafted by Ashton Calvert, the Secretary of DFAT. We sent the Howard letter. But all of that process had happened through 1998, and the fact of the election was, in a sense, and if we lost the election, who knows, but it was, in a sense, immaterial. So I mention all of that because these were two issues that I thought we really needed to focus on trying to sort out. And there was some view in the department that, well, actually, these are unsolvable problems. Well, you know, it was a bit rough on the way through, but we did, of course, but these things always are. But we did solve them. I want to make this point, though. We did something very, very important in 1998, which is completely forgotten now. And that was in 1998, the Asian economic crisis hit. And our neighbours hit the wall. Indonesia lost 14% of its GDP in 1 year. Huge problems. And I think the effort that we made, and I should pay some tribute here also to Peter Costello, the effort that we made to try to help Indonesia, Thailand and South Korea with our support for the IMF, financial support, by the way, for the IMF packages, like $1 billion each. The support that we provided demonstrated what I'm saying, that Australia is a small population, huge country, is a rich country and a successful country. And as those countries, you know, the Asian tigers, remember that expression that was used, the kind of Wirtschaftswunder of Southeast Asia, as they hit the wall, we didn't. We were strong, we remained strong, we didn't go into recession. And we had the resources to deploy to help those countries. And that had, I think, a cathartic effect on how those countries viewed Australia. No, we didn't have a Prime Minister and a Foreign Minister going around claiming we are part of Asia and please, please, will you accept us in some sort of very peripheral organisation called the Asia-European Summit meetings, which, you know, finally, long after I left as Foreign Minister, we got into. But it's immaterial. Begging to get into things like that, it just makes you look weak. Turning up with $1 billion to help Indonesia, the IMF package in Indonesia, that is something that demonstrates strength and commitment to the relationship, the like of which they hadn't seen.
Did that then play a role in the dramatic events of 1999, where two of the nations you mentioned supported the intervention and played a part? And did it influence the way that Indonesia accepted Australia's role in the movement towards independence in East Timor?
Yeah, I definitely think it did. I mean, Australia's voice mattered. It mattered to President Habibie, it mattered to Ali Alatas, the then Foreign Minister, and it mattered to General Wiranto, the then Chief of the Defence Forces. It mattered to these people what we thought, because we were a significant country. We weren't just begging them, please, 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 will you take us into some sort of regional institution. We were doing practical things. So Australia brought strength to the table through its economy, which I've described, and Australia brought strength to the table through its other relationships. There's no country in this neighbourhood which has closer relations with the most powerful country in the world than Australia. The fact that we could call on the Americans, the fact that, you know, we had this intimate alliance relationship with the Americans, it made a huge difference to the way our neighbourhood perceived our country. It doesn't mean anything if we dismiss the importance of the American relationship, or some on the political left would argue in those days. We should focus on our relations with Asia and less on our relationship with America. But our relationship with America was part of what gave us muscle in Asia, which gave us value to Asia, which made us more acceptable to Asia. It was always hard to explain this to people, but I think through the strength of our economy, through the alliance relationship with the United States, through our soft power, our networks around the world, we were able to become a country worth listening to. So when the Howard letter was finally read by President Habibie and read out at a cabinet meeting, well, you know, Australia's changed its policy, so that's it. We're going to change our policy. I haven't noticed commentators saying what an extraordinary exercise of power by Australia that was. And I haven't noticed anyone in East Timor saying, thank you, Mr. Howard, or Alexander Downer, who presided over this. Thank you for sending that letter to President Habibie, and in the end, creating a pathway to our independence as a country.
But you were surprised by the amount of our influence? Would that be true to say?
I was surprised. I was surprised by the Habibie reaction. I remember I was in Dubai on my way to Europe when I to the that Davos World Economic Forum, which for some reason I used to go to. I find it slightly irritating now. It's a sort of virtue signalling melange of rich people getting together. But anyway, it was good for networking. I was on my way there, and I heard the reaction of Habibie and his government to this Howard letter. And of course, we had suggested that they implement their wide-ranging autonomy for a number of years, and then after that have a referendum to see whether these Timorese were happy with it. And he said, well, no, I'm not going to do it for a number of years. We're going to consult them straight away. Not have a referendum, by the way. We're going to consult them straight away, and then we'll decide what to do. We then spent some weeks persuading them that they should have a referendum under UN supervision, and we did persuade them to do that, and persuade the UN to do that, UN to do some good, not just virtue signal, but to come and do some good and useful work. The UN did a grand job in East Timor. It hasn't done too many grand jobs since, but it did a grand job in East Timor, led by Kofi Annan, who was the last really significant Secretary General. And we built a good relationship with him through all of this. But no, this was a demonstration of Australian capability. And of course, as time went on, there was violence in East Timor and all of the controversy about that. We were very usefully told by the political left in Australia we should invade East Timor and end the violence. Invading Indonesia, going to war with Indonesia. I suppose they would have said we didn't conduct the diplomacy right, we just went to war with them. Well, that was what they were suggesting. I wasn't into war with Indonesia, I'm still not. I think that's an exceptionally poor idea. So we did in the end We did, with some difficulty, persuade, first of all, President Habibie to allow for an increase in security in East Timor, and finally we did in the end persuade him, President Clinton, and ultimately the UN Security Council to authorise what became known as Interfet. And I would say, because no one else will say it, I would say this demonstrated Australian strength. It was an incredible thing that we were able to exercise so much influence over the American president, who was very reluctant, whose national security advisor didn't want to have anything, Tony Lake didn't want to have anything to do with East Timor. We roughed up the Americans over that, including in the media. We got President Clinton to agree to provide support. We got the Security Council, the Russians, the Chinese, not just the British, the French and the Americans. It's one thing getting them on side, but getting the Russians and the Chinese. We got them to support the Security Council resolution to support Interfet. We put Interfet together because that was not me, that was the Defence Department that did all of that. But it was me trying to get other countries to support Interfet. We started off modestly with New Zealand, but then we got Britain and we got, who did we get? I think we got some Singaporeans and Thais. And, I think eventually we got Jordanians and so on. So we did a remarkable thing. I mean, and we're attacked over this East Timor stuff the whole time, but we did a remarkable thing. And a great, I want to say this, an exercise of Australian power, which again gave us still more prestige in the region. Because although I remember the then and now Malaysian Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir attacking us for our troops going into East Timor and bullying Asian people, sort of language he used. Unattractive language, I'll be honest. But, some people may have thought that, but what we, sometimes in life when people think and say things, you think, so what? Well, so what that you think that? They weren't bullying anybody, but so what that you think that? Because what it really demonstrated was the power of Australia. I mean, we had a defence force that could deploy quickly, efficiently. It didn't shoot people. We didn't go to war with East Timor. We took control of the place. We left it in peace. We brought peace to it and we left it in peace. So we provided billions of dollars of support for Asia during the Asian economic crisis. We'd helped Indonesia through its transition to democracy. We had helped President Habibie quite substantially through all of that period, who is completely forgotten now already after just a couple of decades, was very much the father of democracy in Indonesia. We helped him a lot. We delivered independence to East Timor. And at the end of all of that, by the time you get to the end of 1999, we've done all of that, Australia in the Asia-Pacific region really counted. It really mattered. It was an important country. Everybody woke up to Australia.
And what was the difference you noted with the election of the Bush administration? What were the main contrasts between the Clinton years and then the Bush years in your experience as the foreign minister?
Well, the Bush administration was more naturally likely to agree with us because they were Tories. I think our personal relationships, honestly, were in the main warmer. I mean, certainly our John Howard and my personal relationship with President Bush was much closer than our relationship with President Clinton.
But was that cold and frosty? And this is
cold
warm.
And frosty,
it wasn't that, was it?
No.
But it just didn't have the warmth and the depth
it didn't have
you're
the
believing after
mateship
2000. Yeah.
The common bonds. We'd sit around. Well, President Bush is a very funny man, but I tragically tell you, is not very politically correct. I mean, and obviously we were truly shocked by that. But so we would sit around with him and spend quite a lot of time having fun and laughing. And we had common, if you like, political enemies. I don't mean enemies like, other countries or Al-Qaeda or something, but I mean just in a partisan and domestic partisan sense. But, you know, that's not to gainsay the some of the relationships we built up with the Clinton administration. I mean, I was very close to Madeleine Albright. I mean, I still see her and communicated with her in the last week. I see her a couple of times a year, Madeleine Albright, and some of the other people from the Clinton administration I've been friendly with. But I think, you know, with Condi Rice, with Colin Powell, Stephen Hadley, the National Security Advisor, people like that. No, we had a great bond with them.
And what about...
They're good people. That Condi Rice, she's a gun.
I'll let that stand on the public record.
Absolutely, she's a wonderful woman. If only she had wanted to be the President of the United States. If only today she were the President of the United States. Wow, that would be fantastic.
Would you say, though, that your relationship with John Howard was plainly close and harmonious? You worked as partners in many areas of foreign policy. Is it true to say, though, that he was much more dominant in defence?
In much more than foreign policy, I can tell you. We were very close.
But in terms of defence, someone said to me that Malcolm Fraser, even when he was the Prime Minister, was really the Defence Minister, and Jim Killen and Ian Sinclair, for instance, kind of echoed some of the things that he wanted. Was that also true of John Howard, that he was particularly involved in defence, more so than in your department?
He wasn't day-to-day involved in my department at all. I mean, he basically left foreign policy to me, basically. So when it came to a big thing like the Howard letter on East Timor, well, I mean, he focused his mind substantially on that, and we had a National Security Committee of Cabinet meeting to discuss it. But, you know, the broader strategy was done by me as the Minister. With defence, it's probably a simplification to say he was his own Defence Minister, but he was very interested in defence, and the thing about him, I think this would be the best way of putting it, he wasn't involved in it day to day. As a Prime Minister, he had thousands of things to do. But and by the way, a Prime Minister has to spend a lot of his or her time on internal party management. It's a very important issue for a Prime Minister, something that the likes of Kevin Rudd might like to reflect on, because you've got to be good at that to remain the Prime Minister. But John Howard had a great affection for the Australian Defence Force, and there was a great moment in history here when we were putting together Interfet. And we had many. We had a National Security of Cabinet meeting to discuss, or one of many, to discuss the force structure. Well, we're basically just taking the advice of the CDF and the Chief of the Army and so on. That's basically an army operation. And they were sort of briefing us on this. I think Peter Cosgrove, I think, was there as well. And I remember myself saying, they were saying we need around 5,000 troops. And I remember myself saying, well, that shouldn't be much of a problem. We easily have 5,000 troops. And they explained how that was a huge problem. And that was stretching the Australian Defence Force to the limit. And the other thing is that we didn't have the heavy lift capability to get these troops there easily. I mean, it's old C-130s, the HMAS Tobruk or whatever it was, some old tub. So we didn't have the modern equipment we needed. And sort of John Howard and I looked at each other, but we got all these battalions and we spend all this money on defence. How is it from there, John Howard really drove to build up the Defence Force. We increased numbers. We spent a huge amount of money, but we bought the C-17s, we built ships, we bought tanks, new generations of tanks. Hey, we did amazing things. And I would say, Prime Ministers always say everything that happened during the life of my government was me. Well, of course it wasn't. Prime Ministers can't do all of that. Much of it is done by the ministers. But I would say that this great build-up of the Australian Defence Force was driven by John Howard himself and his enthusiasm for the Australian Defence Force. He had a great love of the Australian Defence Force. But I mean, day to day, the Minister and the Secretary and the CDF ran the show.
Well, can I ask you a final question then? In 2007, things weren't going well for the government in the polls. But
often things weren't going well for the government in the polls. We always assumed that we'd come up with a cunning plan and win in the end. In 2007, we didn't.
But foreign policy had gone well for the coalition in its years, but it wasn't the kind of thing that was going to save the government from perhaps the its time factor in November 2007, would you say?
I would. I think the polling showed that if we could use that as a guide, that the public thought well of the government's security policies and its economic policies and its trade policies. So we weren't in any way in trouble when it came to almost any policy, actually. So our budget, for which Peter Costello was responsible, our budget in 2007 was pretty much the most popular budget there had ever been, and I think has ever been. I don't think any of the budgets since, well, some of them have been pretty unpopular, for good reason. But I don't think any subsequent budget has been more popular than that budget. It was incredibly popular. So our foreign policy and security policy was popular. Our economic policy was popular. Australia was going very well. We introduced some initiatives to deal with, the so-called Northern Territory intervention. We had the $10 billion Murray-Darling initiative at the beginning of 2007. That was very necessary, but it also happened to be very popular. The Indigenous intervention was very necessary. But it was also popular. There was the climate change issue that we wrestled with a bit. And work choices, I suppose, was not sort of so popular. But I don't know, I think in the end it wasn't that. It wasn't any of those things. It was just that people were tired of us. They just had enough of us. And I think, a couple of years later they thought, well, maybe we shouldn't have been like that. But, I think something else. I think something else, which I don't think my other most important colleagues in that government, John Howard and Peter Costello, so the three of us were together through, not just through all of those years, but in opposition as two of us were the leaders of the opposition and one was the deputy leader. So you can imagine well before the election we were all the three of us all working together in reasonable, if not ever perfect, harmony. But I think by 2007 we had run our race. I'll never forget in about February, March 2007, John Howard coming to my electorate because it included the mouth of the Murray for some event in relation to our $10 million Murray-Darling initiative. And afterwards he and I just went off to have something to eat in a local cafe in Galway. And he was saying to me, I don't know, just look at these polls, they're just terrible. We're just doing, private polling's the same. I mean, the public are happy with what we're doing, but we're just going so badly. And he said, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, we need to have a fight with the Labor Party, because Kevin Rudd kept saying, I would do, whatever the government does, I'll match. I'm a fiscal conservative, as you know. He turned out to be completely reckless with money, but he claimed he was a fiscal conservative, claimed all sorts of things, Kevin. I said to John Howard, well, I mean, in the end, we really need to have a great fight. We need to have a great fight with the Labor Party about something. We need politically to go to war with them. So we need some breathtaking initiative that they can't support to demonstrate our continuing energy and our fight. And he said to me, the trouble is we've kind of done everything that we wanted to do. And I said, yes, that is a problem. So even deregulating the labour market, I know it's been re-regulated, which is why unemployment here is higher than it should be. And wages growth, of course, has been very flat as well in Australia. Well, congratulations for re-regulating the labour market. So I know it's been, some of these reforms have been turned back, but at that time, we were talking in 2007, we'd made all of these reforms, introduced the GST, balanced the budget, paid off the government debt, done all those things in foreign policy, built up the defence force, the economy was motoring along. We were making reforms in areas like health and education. I think in education perhaps we could have done more in areas like education. I think we perhaps didn't achieve as much as in retrospect we could have done, but we had made reforms in all of these areas, and this place was just going really well. And that's the trouble. People just got sick of us as people. They're probably watching this. They're reminded how sick of us they were. But just got sick of us.
On that note, we probably should end. Alexander Downer, thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure. Sorry not to be there in person.